non-fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Letters from a Serial Killer. That's today's subject in the House of Mystery. Joining us is Kristi Belcamino, crime fiction writer and a cop beat reporter, best known for her Gabriella Giovanni mystery series. In the first book in the series, Blessed Are the Dead, based on her dealings with a serial killer, was nominated for a 2015 Anthony and McCavity Award for Best First Novel. And now her latest novella, Letters from a Serial Killer, actually goes into detail about the jailhouse conversations and the letters she received from behind bars from a serial killer abductor. Now, Xiana Fairchild was snatched off the streets in Vallejo, California, on her way to the school bus stop, and she was never seen again. That led the newspaper reporter that was covering the story, who's our guest, Kristi Belcamino, and the mother who raised her, to face the accused in prison, Curtis Anderson, to find out exactly what happened to Xiana and where she could be. And now we welcome to the show Kristi Belcamino. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me, Al.
Where did you get the interest in writing about true crime?
Well, so I was a newspaper reporter in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there was a story that came across my beat. A little girl named Xiana Fairchild who disappeared on her way to the school bus stop. And it quickly became clear that it was a kidnapping. And for a long time, we didn't know what had happened. It became clear it was a stranger abduction. And there were no suspects, basically. Nobody had any idea what had happened to this little girl. And about 6 months after her disappearance, another little girl who basically fit her general description and lived within, I think, a mile of her house in Vallejo, California, was also kidnapped on the way home from school. But this little girl managed to escape. The man had kept her for 3 days in his car, and she was able to unlock the chains that were keeping her bound to the steering column and started to run away while he was in his old work picking up something. He noticed that she was getting away, and he started to chase her across the parking lot. She was able to flag down a truck driver, basically said, "I'm the little girl who was kidnapped from Vallejo." The truck driver was able to get the man's license plate number before he drove away, and he was arrested within a few hours. So as soon as that arrest was made public, the immediate suspicion was that this man might have been connected to also kidnapping Xiana Fairchild. The similarities were just too strong. So I and other people requested interviews with him in jail because at the time, I don't know if they still do this in California in the newspaper world, but we could send a request, and if an inmate wanted to talk to you, then you could go in and talk to him. So I immediately asked him if he had taken Xiana Fairchild, and he started kind of leading me on. Like, I can't tell you that, but I'll tell you something one day. Meanwhile, during the whole entire disappearance of Xiana, I had become friends with the woman who had raised her, Stephanie Kahalekulu. And shortly after this man's kidnapping, she also went into the jail and started questioning him. Do you have Xiana? Did you take Xiana? Do you know what happened to her? And he would give us little tidbits of information, and it quickly became clear that he had been kidnapping and killing people for a long time. And he'd give us little bits of information and say, I will eventually tell you what happened to Xiana. That's what he was telling me. Meanwhile, he was telling the mother, Stephanie, I have her. Someone has her. I took her. She's still alive. Give me money, and I'll make sure nothing happens to her, and I'll eventually tell you where she is. And Stephanie didn't know whether to believe him or not. I didn't know whether to believe him or not. And at some point during this, I think it was 2 months after we started talking to him, they found Xiana's remains. So all bets were off. He couldn't play his little game with Stephanie that Xiana was still alive. But at that point, my goal and Stephanie's goal was to get him to tell us enough so he would also be convicted of that crime, and that we would know exactly what happened to her and where the rest of her was, because it was only her partial remains. So all that happened, and somewhere along the line, other stories happened, like 9/11 and some other big stories in the newspaper, and he sort of faded out of my world, at least, out of my reporting job as a newspaper reporter. And then I got pregnant and had a kid and decided to move to Minnesota, where my husband's family is, and I quit my reporting job. And I had 2 little girls, and I realized that as I was a mother, and I was an extremely paranoid mother of 2 little girls, because I knew that people who kidnapped and killed little girls existed, and I had letters that I carried across the country from him. I had notes and notebooks of conversations with him. And so I realized I was being extremely paranoid. I would call their names if they were in our fenced backyard to make sure they were okay, and I wasn't being a very good mother. I was so worried about them all the time. And so my form of therapy was to sit down and write a book about it. And I wrote a fiction book about a newspaper reporter who was dealing with a serial killer trying to find out what happened to a missing little girl. And by writing that book, Blessed Are the Dead, I was able to get this guy out of my head for the most part. I was able to let go of all that extreme paranoia and fear and just sort of put it on paper and let it go. And luckily enough, I was able to sell the book. HarperCollins bought it, and I realized I loved the world so much that I wrote several other books. So HarperCollins published 4 books in that series. The last book came out in September, and there'll be another one in the future. But meanwhile, Stephanie and I kept in touch over the years, and we talked about how this guy had affected our parenting and how we were pretty messed up from it and from dealing with him. And we talked about sharing our letters. We talked about maybe doing a blog post on my website, or we weren't really sure what to do with it. And we kind of put it off for years. I think it was really hard for Stephanie to go back and deal with that. But this winter, I said, hey, Stephanie, I'm thinking about writing a book. Do you want to write it with me? And she said, yeah, I think I need to. I think it's good therapy and healing for me. So we sat down and we, over mail, of course, she's in California still, and I'm in Minnesota, we co-wrote Letters from a Serial Killer. And it's pretty much the first time we have shared our stories, our dealings with this guy, our conversations on the phone, in person, and our letters. And that's a very long-winded introduction.
Well, that's it covered it. Yeah, it's good. Well,
okay, good. Okay.
No, that's interesting. I think that just going in and seeing him, you probably didn't realize that it was going to be such a changing event in your life.
I had no idea how it would affect me, 15 years later.
And now I've also noticed, like, so on even your fiction books, you kind of take them and center them around something that is true to life, like this event. So Blessed was sort of a story centered around the missing girl here.
Right. It was inspired by that. Yes, it was a way to basically make him die a really bad death in fiction. And that's what's fun about writing fiction is in the real world, sometimes justice is not served, and in fiction, you can make justice served. You can get justice and revenge and all these other things. So that's the fun about writing fiction.
Yeah, you can have the happy ending.
Exactly.
Yeah. And now, so when you actually went in to meet him for the first time, what were you thinking? As in, what did you think you'd deal with? Like, did you really think he was the guy, or?
I sort of did think he was the guy. I thought it was just too coincidental for their. Well, let me back up. Stranger abductions are extremely rare, even though they seem so prevalent in the media because we do make a big deal of them. It's very important to get the word out when there's a missing child, especially a stranger abduction. But in reality, they're very, very rare. And so the odds of a stranger taking two different girls within 6 months, within a mile of one another, with similar ages and physical descriptions, I couldn't imagine that there were two different people doing it. So yeah, I did think he was probably the one from the get-go, and I didn't know what to think. I'm sure I was nervous. I had interviewed murderers before because for some reason a lot of them like to talk to reporters. I'm not quite sure why, but I don't argue with them. And I'd actually been threatened by a guy who was accused of kidnapping and killing little girls before. So I don't know. I wasn't super concerned. I was more interested in getting him to talk.
And so how was that? Like, what was he pretty easy to talk to? Was he willing to kind of give you a lot of information, or? He was
very willing to talk. He was very egocentric. He was megalomaniac. He thought he was really cool and really smart, so he loved to talk. However, he would do a really good job of avoiding giving you a straight answer. I would say, okay, did you kill her? Did you take her? I can't answer that. Okay, then tell me you didn't take her. And he would, well, I don't want the DA to come give me more charges. And I'd say, okay, well, you tell me you didn't lie. So if you don't lie, but you won't tell me you didn't take her, then I'm assuming you did. And he'd say something like, well, your intuition is good. No, he was always playing a little cat and mouse game and I could never nail him down to give me a straight answer. And I'd say, well, I don't believe you. I don't think you're telling the truth. And then he would make up some story. So I found it extremely frustrating that I could never get a straight answer. And the few times he gave me really, true information, he would write it. He would take out a little piece of paper and a little pencil he had hidden because I don't think he was supposed to have any of that. And he would write it on a piece of paper, and then he'd hold it up to the glass for me to read. And then I thought he wadded it up. That's what he said when he did that for her. He'd wad it up and eat it and swallow it. And maybe I blocked that part out. It was just, yeah. But I remember he would wad it up and then do something with it. But he would communicate with us that way because he knew that our interviews were recorded. There was a camera in the room recording what we said and did. And so the first time he told me he actually killed people, I was goading him on. I said, I know that you want to tell somebody something. I said, I know you want to just talk about it. Why don't you talk to me? Yeah, I'm not a police officer. I'm not the district attorney. Just tell me about it. Why not just tell me? You want to get it off your chest. And his answer was, well, I've been keeping in stuff worse than that for more than 20 years. And I said, well, what do you mean? What could be worse than that? What could be worse than kidnapping a little girl? And that's when he got out his little piece of paper and he wrote, he wrote something and he held it up to the window and it said, first kidnap, 1981. First kidnap, 1981. Rape, kill. And then he wadded it back up. And my blood went cold. That was the first time he, really told me he'd been raping and killing people for 20 years. And then, so I'd ask him, well, remember what we talked about when you held up that piece of paper? Where are these people? And then he'd have me bring maps in, and he'd point on the maps. And there was never anything ever found. I know the FBI, they have a website up right now talking about his victims and still trying to find information on it. But he never gave me specifics about his victims. He would say that most of them were people who wouldn't be missed. Like some of his early victims were runaways that people would never know if they were missing.
So now, when you were doing this, and the mother Stephanie was doing it, did you guys know you were each seeing him, and were you communicating at that time?
Well, no. I knew she was visiting him, and she knew I was visiting him. But we hadn't really shared a lot of our conversation for some reason. I think we had to a certain extent. But the first time he told me he'd been killing people, I got in my car after the interview, and instead of calling, I was on my way back to the newspaper to write a story about it. This was at night. And instead of calling my editor, which is usually your first call, or calling my husband and freaking out, I called Stephanie. And I said, Stephanie, he told me he's been doing this and he's been killing people. And I, kind of spilled everything to her. And she said, yes, I know. He told me 2 months ago that he confessed he took Xiana and that she's alive, and that's when she started telling me what he'd been telling her. He told her not to tell anyone because, of course, I'm probably the last person Stephanie would necessarily want to tell, because I probably would put it in the paper, unless she told me not to, and then of course I wouldn't. But, she didn't want it in the paper because then she would be disobeying him, and he was really into her obeying what he did, because he threatened to hurt Xiana if she didn't do what he said. So she told me that, and I said, well, is it okay if I, put this in the paper? And she said yes. And so then, the story was, basically he told Xiana's mother, the woman who raised her, that he took her, and he's been trying to get money out of her for the last 2 months. And so from that point on, we basically shared all information about it. But she kept it secret, and she had to for 2 months, that he had told her early on that he took Xiana. So.
I was just wondering, because then, so he was treating both of you quite a bit different. Like he had
very different.
Yeah, so he had a different angle on her than he did on you.
Yes, he was very careful with me. He was more, and this is disgusting, but he would flirt, if that makes sense, and sort of try to be all, gee, golly shucks with me, and sort of smile and try to be winning, I guess, or charming. And with her, he was mean. He was just flat out mean and crude and rude. And I think the difference was is he knew that if he did that with me, it was my job, and I could just walk away or send another reporter. And he knew with Stephanie that it was her kid, and that she unfortunately had to keep coming back and listening to that. And she was very, very strong. She called him out on it all the time. She'd tell him quit, talking to me this way or quit doing this. But he was terrible to her. I mean, the things that she shared in her letters and their conversations are awful. Like she is such a strong woman to just keep going back to find out what happened to her daughter. And being strong against such a terrible person.
And how were the police about you and her both going in and visiting him?
It's really funny because the police never said anything to me about it ever. They never said word one. They never said anything. However, I was always very aware that there was, and I just, had it confirmed just recently when Stephanie and I were talking about it, that FBI and police were listening in to almost every single conversation. I don't know if they did every single reporter that visited him, but I know they read every letter that was exchanged between us. And at one point, they actually kept one of the letters he sent me. I never did receive that, and he was really upset about it. And Stephanie, she found out that yes, the FBI and police, every time she went to visit him, they were in a surveillance room listening in. And so they would talk to her about it. They never coached her, she said. They never told her what to say. They actually were worried about her at first when she said she was going to go visit them. They said they were worried she couldn't handle it. and that it would be too upsetting. And she said, I have to do this. I have to go talk to him. And then once she decided, then I believe she said that she would call him afterwards and fill them in on what conversation took place. So, but they never coached her. They never said, don't say this, don't say that. But one thing that they did tell her, which was extremely creepy, is he would tell her what to wear. I have one of the letters that he sent her, and it would say, you know, on your next visit, I want you to wear your hair up, and I want you to wear that white sweater. And after that letter, the police officers called her in and said, you know, we're a little concerned because based on what we know about this guy, you fit his victim profile to a T. She's petite, she's Hawaiian, you know, she has nice, beautiful olive skin and dark eyes and long black hair and, you know, petite little thing, like just kind of like his, you know, the two girls he kidnapped, you know, the Xiana and then this other little girl. And so they were really concerned about her, that she fit his victim profile, which is extremely creepy.
That's got to be pretty devastating in a way. When he starts telling how to dress, you know, how to keep your hair and stuff like that, with it's kind of weird in a way. What do you think his
kind of?
Well, I'm trying to be. What do you think the end game was? Like, what was?
I think he was trying to manipulate her as much as he possibly could, and it was fun for him. Every single letter he wrote her, every conversation they had, he had a list of questions. Questions like, where were you born? When did you lose your virginity? How long did it take you to grow your hair that long? He constantly was trying to get information about her. I don't recall him doing that with me, and I would not have offered it because I was in a different position than she was. And she avoided most of those questions. And when she did, he would get angry and say, you didn't answer my questions. You know who's going to be punished now.
So at that time, this is before they had found any remains, and
right.
They figured she was still kidnapped somewhere or alive. And how did that change, actually, once they found the remains? Did he sort of change his attitude toward what he was giving you for information?
Yeah, I think after they found her remains is when he started talking a lot more to me. Stephanie, at that point, all the gloves came off for her. Once she knew that he was not keeping Xiana alive and he could not punish her, she was done. You know, there was no playing around. She was already tough. She got really tough then. And I think in both cases he got angry at us because we were just like, okay, whatever, we don't have to be nice to you anymore because we want you convicted, but there's nothing you can do to hurt that little girl anymore. So we're just gonna do whatever. I remember I wrote a profile piece on him. I interviewed a bunch of FBI profiler and a criminologist who studied serial killers, and I had them all analyze him, and they ripped into him. The article was basically that he wasn't nearly as smart as he thought he was, and he was playing these games, and if we didn't pay attention to him, he'd fade away, and that he thought that they called him the poster boy of evil, and it was a really harsh article about how he wasn't as smart as he thought he was, and that maybe he was a terrible person, but he was not a Ted Bundy like he was trying to associate himself with. And so I was waiting to see what his response to that article would be, and he immediately wrote back and was berating me for the article, of course, and making fun. Oh, great expert, Kristi. Yeah, oh, he's real smart. I don't have an ego. I kept this in. Why did it take the police 20 years to arrest me for my first sex crime? And I've been doing it for this long. And if I had such a big ego, then why have I kept it in for, this many years? And so he was really defensive, and it really got the reaction out of him that I guess we kind of wanted, but he still didn't give us any information. And at the same time, he was sort of praising the article. And then he'd say, that's a really good line, Kristi, about my article. So I just never, I don't know. He definitely changed his tenor, though. It was, like I said, it was gloves off, especially for Stephanie. And I think he found he needed to work harder to keep our attention at that point. And that's really what he wanted, was attention. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah, he wanted to feel important,
He wanted to feel important, yep.
Yeah. What did you learn about him, actually, in your, what kind of details? What was he, why was he selecting certain children? Was it just random? Did you learn any of that?
A little bit. He told me, as far as, his victim profile, I don't necessarily know what his first victims look like, but he did make a comment that lately my victims are more petite and ethnic, or so. I don't know how he phrased it. He said something like, I'm more into petite and ethnic looking girls and women now. So I don't know about that. As far as what I learned about him, I think one of the hardest things for me is I could never, ever pinpoint why he was the way he was. And obviously I'm not the only one in the world. I mean, they do autopsies on serial killers to look for their differences in their brain, that may have caused this. But I could never point to anything and say, oh my gosh, you had this really freaky childhood, or these screwed up parents, or none of that. Everything I tried to pinpoint something, and I was like, no, I don't think that makes someone a serial killer. And so that was, the more I found out about his life, the more baffled I was by why he was the way he was.
Yeah, he wasn't out killing puppies and things like that, eh? So.
He might have done some, one or two weird things like that as a kid, but not enough to, not the whole gamut, lighting fires and killing the cat and doing all that. No, It wasn't like that.
Well, and was he married at the time, and did he have kids of his own and a job and all that?
Well, I never ever said this to me, and I didn't find out until he was dead. But he had a kid, I think, and I don't know anything about that person. And I don't know if he was involved at all. He had talked about ex-girlfriends and how they wanted to get married and have kids, and he wasn't ready. But I never knew that he had a child, and I don't believe he was ever married, because I have anything of a paper trail regarding him. I have his original copy of his birth certificate, in my papers. When we were writing about him, I have a gigantic box full of information on him. And so I think if there was ever any legal document of a marriage, that I would have come across it in my research. Not saying it doesn't exist, but it'd be unlikely.
Yeah. How old was he when they actually arrested him?
I think he was 37 or 39.
Okay, so he was an adult.
It's been a while.
Yeah, no.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, he wasn't like some 19-year-old. This guy had been around.
No.
And so he functioned in a job too, and coworkers never knew.
Well, where they found Xiana's remains, he had told me after I went to visit him after that. He said, "Oh yeah, I used to have an airport luggage delivery route that took me up there all the time into those Santa Cruz Mountains, and so I know he worked as a delivery driver for the airport luggage. And then when he took Xiana, Stephanie just told me this. I was a little unclear on it, but he had worked as a cab driver, and the cab company was really closed about giving us details about when he quit. But Stephanie told me that what she heard was that he quit at 3 a.m. from this cab company, and Xiana was taken at 7:30 a.m. And it was the cab stand was pretty close to the bus stop where she where she caught the bus in the morning. So I think he only had the job for a little while. Oh, the other reason I was going to say is he was in prison off and on for most of his life. So there wasn't a real strong job history there.
Right. And, yeah, I could see that. And plus, being a cab driver, I'm sure that people wouldn't necessarily notice, things you were doing, because you're not like in an office or something, side by side.
Yep.
And there was also a little controversy, wasn't there, like about the, she was picked up from a bus stop, going to school, and about her birth mother's boyfriend giving different stories.
Yeah. The birth mother's boyfriend had a conviction for child abuse, I believe. And so he said that when she went missing, he said, it was raining, so I drove her to the bus stop that morning so she didn't have to walk in the rain. And then it ended up that I think he held the press conference. The reason I say I think is, this was a long time ago, and I don't have, necessarily every single moment ingrained in my mind. I think I blocked out a lot of it. But he either held a press conference or the police held a press conference where he announced, I lied. I didn't drive her to the bus stop. I was so worried about this conviction I had that I thought I'd immediately be a suspect. And so he's trying to make himself look good, I believe. Anyway,
it must have made it worse.
It made it worse because I don't think that when you're doing an investigation, you don't want to go off on a different tangent. You need to know exactly what, for the police, obviously investigators, they needed to know exactly where to start looking. And in this case, it would have been walking out her front door. If they're going to retrace her path, it would have been walking out of that apartment door and not instead of starting at the bus stop. There's a lot in between that bus stop and her apartment door. So.
Yeah. And so how do you find that this has changed you now that you've been able to write about it and write about your interaction with him?
As far as this most recent book, The Letters from a Serial Killer?
Yeah, like I'd imagine writing both books has kind of led a lot of it out.
Yeah.
Are you a little bit more relaxed now?
I am. I think it was good to go revisit what I was going through at that time. Because even though when I wrote Blessed of the Dead, I was also writing it loosely based on it. My character is not me, and she lived a different life than I did, and the story played out differently. But in this book, I go back and talk about what it was like to cover that story, and I hadn't really revisited it in that depth, and neither did Stephanie. This was the first time, she looked at some of these letters, or that I drug up some of these letters and went over it. And so it's always good to get that stuff out of your head on paper. I mean, writing has been my therapy my entire life. So I think it's really good. I'm honored that Stephanie trusted me and that our friendship was strong enough to do this. She told me, she's been approached over the years numerous times by people wanting to write books with her or write articles, and she just always said no. And she said, I feel like I can do this with you, Kristi. So I'm extremely honored that she opened up like that and did it. And I told her, I said, you can be as little involved as in zero involved or as much involved in this book. And she went all in. I mean, we are co-authors. It's me and her together, and we've gone over every single word together. And I think she's extremely strong and brave to do that.
How do you think she's dealing with it now?
I think that as far as dealing with writing the book or dealing with what happened?
Yeah, just everything, right? Because it's a little bit of time now, and she's written the book with you. Do you think she's somewhat resolved?
No, I don't think it'll ever be resolved, but what I do think is I think it was very empowering for her to write the book. She, for so much of this, was a helpless victim. As strong and brave as she was, and as much as she did to, put her heart and soul into finding that little girl and into seeking justice, so much of it was out of her control, no matter how strong and brave she was. And so in this respect, writing this book was empowering. She was able to talk about it and say, this is what I did, this is what I lived, this is my experience. And I think that's great for her. I'm like I said, I'm just really honored that she did this with me. And I think that, while the book is heart-wrenching, it's also really, really true and really, really honest. And it just, we really put ourselves out there in this book.
Yeah, I think it's great. I just can't help but thinking of the Silence of the Lambs, the movie. Going in, and, when you go in and talk to a serial killer like that, and so he ended up getting convicted, of course.
He was convicted of the first kidnapping, or the second one where the girl escaped, and he was sentenced to 251 years in prison. And then shortly before he died, he pleaded guilty to kidnapping and killing Xiana as well. I'm not sure exactly how that took place, except I don't know if he called the FBI in or the FBI was already dealing with him and trying to find out more about his victims. But he went to court and pleaded guilty to that one. And then not too long after that, actually on I think it was the 9-year anniversary of Xiana's kidnapping, he had some type of medical incident. So that day, 9 years to the day, he was taken from the jail to the hospital, and he died a couple days later.
Oh, so there was a little bit of justice.
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you start over? The dog was barking.
I was going to say, well, there's a little bit of justice in reality in this case. Then, Yeah. It was interesting how it was 9 years to the day that he took ill and then died. So I don't know. Yeah. Go figure. And so in your Blessed book, how did you create the character, like the person that was doing the investigation? You said she was quite different than you.
Oh yeah, I'd always wanted to write a book with a reporter in it because that was my big passion, was journalism and reporting. And I also had always wanted to write a very Italian-American character. I am part Italian-American. My character is way Italian-American. and so I started writing, and she took on this whole life of her own. She became this woman who lived in San Francisco in the cool part of town that I could never afford to live in. So I lived in Oakland, which I love Oakland, but I could never afford to live in North Beach, San Francisco. It just was not on a reporter's salary. So I made her live there. And I gave her this giant family that all lived in the Bay Area, and she would go over and have Sunday dinners at Grandma's, big Sunday dinner every week at Grandma's. And it's funny because in my real life, I'm married to an Irish man. And so every Sunday we go over to his mom's house for a big party with all the big family. So I kind of live it, but in a different way. It's not, she's also more outgoing. Just a different person. I did a Myers-Briggs personality test, and people kept saying, "Aren't you Gabriella?" And I said, "No, I'm not Gabriella." And so I took a Myers-Briggs personality test. I had her answer it as she would, and then I had my, how I would answer it, and I found out we were polar opposites. She's my alter ego, like the person I might have been in another life.
Oh, that's sort of fun. Now, how many books have you written with Gabriella Giovanni as the character?
So I have 4 books published, The most recent one was in September, and I'm writing the 5th book in the series as we speak.
How long does it take you to write one of those books? Like how much of your time?
Yeah, I treat it like a job. I work, pretty much every day, Monday through Friday. Usually about 9, it's a shortened day, probably about 9 to 3 every day I'm working on my book. And it usually takes me 3 months to get a rough draft, and then about another month to polish it and make it look pretty.
So where do you have your character going this next book?
Oh, I'm not sure I can say, but it's in the southern hemisphere, and they speak Spanish, and yeah. So I'll go. How about that?
Okay. Well, that's a clue.
Okay.
That's a clue. So your character is a reporter, right? And
yes.
But she travels around, obviously, to different crime scenes.
Yep.
Wow. And
yeah.
How do you pick
normally in the Bay Area?
How do you pick the crimes? Like what? How do you choose? Are they all based on some sort of real true crime somewhere?
No. When an editor first wanted to buy Blessed Are the Dead and they wanted more books, I remember thinking, well, I don't know how to write another book. I was inspired by a true life thing. I just can't make something up out of the air now. But then I did. So I don't know how that happened. I'm just glad it did. And then they said, well, we want another book. And I thought, now I have to come up with something else. And surprisingly, it was easier than I thought. But I remember being very worried and intimidated. And I think a lot of writers feel this way. Somehow, there's two writers. There's one who has so many ideas they'll never write all the books in their lifetime. And then there's ones like me who think, I don't think I can ever come up with another book idea to save me. And I always do, so I don't know.
Just go with it. And so who are your influences?
Oh, I absolutely adore, a couple different writers. I love Lisa Unger. She's more of a psychological thriller suspense writer than I am, but I just want to be her one day so badly. She's so talented and wonderful. I also really love Laura Lippman, who has a reporter character in her books. Not all of her books, but she has a series with reporters. I love all of her books. I'm really lately loving a newer author in the last couple of years, Alex Marwood, who lives in the United Kingdom. She's fantastic. And one of my other new favorites is Chelsea Kane, and she writes really, really dark serial killer books with a serial killer who's a beautiful woman. And she is not for the faint-hearted. She's got some dark, gory stuff, and I adore her. So those are probably, there's too many to name, but those are my top 4 loves, I guess, for writing.
Yeah. Do you ever plan on getting dark and gory like that as well, or?
I think I'm already dark. But I don't go into gore very much. I know I'm dark. I had a reviewer, tell me how dark I was the other day. So I sort of take it as a compliment, but I'm glad that the cover of my book, let's see, which book is it? Oh, Blessed Are Those Who Weep says, tense, disturbing, and smart. And so someone's not going to take that up and think it's lighthearted. They'll know. I don't want them to be surprised. It says disturbing on the cover, so don't be surprised. It's a little disturbing inside. I don't want to mislead you or give you, maybe it's not the right book for you.
Yeah. So now how do people get a hold of you or get a hold of your books?
Yeah, well, I'm in several different places, but probably the most central point to find all the other places is my website, and that's KristiBelcamino.com, but that's a mouthful. You can also find it it also comes up if you type in Blessed Are the Dead, blessedarethedead.com. KristiBelcamino.com will come up, and I'm really active on my Facebook author page. I love interacting with people, so I'm probably mostly on there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us a little bit about you and your writing, and it's been really interesting, and we wish you the best of luck coming up.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and maybe in the future we can get Stephanie on board too. She has a lot of really interesting things to say. I know she's busy right now though, but.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But she's 50-50 with me on this book. We did it all together. So.
The mission has been completed.
The end. By George, he's got it. It is the end. I'll say it.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.